Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak briefly on the relationship that can be ascribed to revisionism and Middle East. And of course, when I say Middle East, I understand basically the heart of the problem of the Middle East, which is Palestine. I would like first to allude to a well-known politician, which is maybe the most hated politician by the Western press. His name is Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and he was a member of a great Palestinian family and a mufti of Jerusalem. This man has an incredible political career, which makes it a fascinating personage of our history. During the 30s, he was one of the leaders of the beginning of, after all, we could call that Intifada. It was the struggle that the Palestinians started in the 30s, in the mid-30s, against the growing influence of the Jewish organization, the Zionist agency, and the obvious complacency of the British authorities towards the Zionist enterprise. They had started first with the Balfour Declaration in 1917. So then the war came up, and Al-Hajj Amin decided to try to strike an alliance with the enemies of Britain, because Britain was the colonial power. And the enemies of Britain were basically fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Obviously, Amin was a nationalist, was someone who wanted the independence of Palestine in the hands of the Palestinians. And we could safely describe him as an Arab nationalist. But he tried to get some kind of support from the Rome regime, from Mussolini, who was ambiguous, ambivalent, who had Zionist friendships and also pro-Arab approaches. And later also with the Nazi Germany, which is a long story that I'm not going to tell now, but just to say that there was already a connection between the Middle East, meaning the Palestine problem, and the European politics and the war and what happened during this World War II period in Europe and in the Middle East. We should remember, for instance, that there was an attempt in Baghdad by a coup to establish a regime that would be anti-British and in good relations with the Germans. There was an agitation in Egypt at the time where Marshal Rommel was advancing towards it. So it's a long story, in fact, which is totally obscured today, totally vanished between the Middle East and the events basically in Nazi-dominated Europe at the time of the war. And of course, the way the war finished by a total defeat of the fascist regime and the Nazi regime meant also that all those who had supported this struggle, this basically anti-British struggle, anti-colonial struggle, were totally forgotten. They were either in jail or they were politically destroyed, and they could not fight on at the time. And so we have a period just after the war of total colonial domination. And when the people in those areas started to react, they met brute force. I remind what happened in 45 in Algeria, in French Algeria, when the Algerians believed that the end of the war was meaning also the beginning of freedom for them. The army and the colonels made a massacre in Sétif and other places that was extremely bloody. The same in some places in colonial Africa. People believed wrongly that this so-called fight for freedom was also for their own freedom. No, it was not so. It was for the masters, for the colonial system to survive. So this period of just after the war is a period where nobody in the Middle East was in a position to question the results of the war, because there was an immediate suppression. Remember also riots in Cairo and places like that. So the criticism of what has happened, the attempt to analyze the events of the war, and particularly of what happened in the concentration camps, and particularly of what happened to the Jews of Europe, this could be played only in Western Europe and not in the Middle East, because those actors in the Middle East were silenced. And that explains, I believe, in great part, why it was possible to establish the Zionist entity as a state in 1948, because the local populace, the local politicians, the local people had no power and no access to a political life that would allow them to oppose this kind of move in an efficient way. So when the first revisionists started to work, let's say 47, 48, and they started to understand that something wrong was presented in the way the war was explained, in the results of that war, which was a complete domination of Europe by external forces, by the Soviet Union and by the United States of America. There was the question of what had happened in the camps. And people like the French socialist Racinier started to analyze all these tales that were told by survivors, and he found that something was wrong, that of course a lot of atrocities had taken place, a lot of horrors, but they needed some kind of explanation that was not exclusively the evilness of the Germans, that there were other factors in this situation, including the desire of the communists to dominate half of Europe and to justify this domination by making the Germans look as bad as possible. And the propaganda machine of all the Allies, in fact, had been running so highly that there was a picture of what happened in Germany that was totally distorted. And Racinier and others after him and with him started to go back to the facts, try to establish what had really happened and distinguish the facts from the legends, the myth, the rumors that had been pervasive in all of Europe during the war. It's only a bit later than they understood that there was some kind of connection between that situation of a total destruction of everything German and the situation of the Middle East. And Racinier was, for instance, extremely interested by the question of oil. He wrote his last articles mostly on the oil as a factor of war, as the cause for the next world war. And when we read that retrospectively, it's a bit prophetic, because we can see that he was absolutely right. On his side, Mr. Zundel, who, I remind you, is in jail since several years and will be condemned to even more years of jail, had written in the 80s a small article on Islam and the West, and he sent it, he tried to mail it to as many people as possible in the Middle East to raise their conscience to the fact that revisionism was part of their own problem with the West, that the domination of the West was also based on a number of lies and rumors and everything. This attempt was met with little success. Some years later, Professor Faurisson, who is here, also sent messages and write letters to Middle East political leaders to warn them that they had in their hands something that was potentially what he called the atomic weapon of the Poors, meaning revisionism as a way to destroy the ideology, dominating ideology of Zionism and Western powers. But again, to very little avail. So we have been waiting for many years until one book that was published first in France, written by a former communist leader. He had been a leader of the Communist Party for many years. But he had left this communism and he had converted to Islam. His name is Roger Garaudy. Garaudy wrote a book with a revisionist chapter. He borrowed from Faurisson and from other authors. And this book created an enormous scandal in France and in the West. It was translated in Arabic very soon. I counted 3 editions in different countries. And by the end of 1996, he made a tour of the Middle East. He visited Jordan and Egypt and Syria, I think, and Tehran. He came to Tehran at the end of 96. His book was translated. And so from that time, the revisionism became something that existed in the conscience of the people in the Middle East, but in a conflictual way, because always among the elites of those countries, there is a strong element that is wanting to accommodate to the West, that is wanting to kneeling down before Zionism, or trying to please the Jews, because they thought it would be the best solution for their own interests. And so there was, let's say, 10 years of conflictual views, of low-level discussions, of although a number of articles were published in the press, but with not a great scientific value, let's say. Until recently, when, by some kind of miracle, the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who obviously had studied the question in detail, had access to the basic documents, made the declarations you've heard, and this created an entirely new situation, like opening a door. He kicks the door open, and I think the first consequence is the fact that we have this meeting, which was not possible in any country, in any place in the world since 20 years. So this is a great novelty, this is a great initiative, and obviously this is the beginning of a new era where the revisionist question, when the work of the revisionists will be inserted in the political life of the Middle East and will be used as a weapon to destroy the basis of the so-called legitimacy of Israel, because Israel, as you know, Ben Gurion was not so sure that Israel could survive, especially with only military forces, and he was looking for some kind of device to create a legitimacy to Israel, and he decided to abduct a low-level Nazi official who was living in Germany called Adolf Eichmann. And he organized a trial in such a way that from this trial, everybody, first the Jews, then the Westerners, the Americans, everybody would feel guilty of not having saved the Jews during the war. So this device of making a universal guilt acting as a kind of a buffer to Israel, a buffer from any criticism, any questioning about the type of action they were doing. This criticism is the only thing that revisionism can destroy. Only revisionism can destroy this basis of the existence of Israel. And I believe this is a vital question for the future of this region, because as the president said, Israel must be wiped off the map. Israel will be wiped off the map by a lot of devices, and probably by the politics of the Jews themselves. It is my own intimate conviction that the worst enemies of Israel are and will be the Jews and their divisions. So we think that revisionism has a role to play, and we believe that after this conference it will go on in a more active way. Thank you.
مهمانان خارجی به همراه سخنرانان ایرانی رأس ساعت 15 3 بعد از ظهر